The most important day in the year for our Neolithic ancestors of Europe was the winter solstice, what we would know as the shortest day of the year, but what our ancestors thought of as the longest night of the year. And in this video, I'm going to tell you about the ritual and belief that supports our theory of why the day with the longest night of the year was so important to our ancestors, its association with death, rebirth, and the stone monuments that have been built to support this. And so, grab yourself a cup of tea and welcome to Creckenfold. To first understand how our ancestors understood the year, we first need to understand how they understood a day. This is because they looked at the world very differently to ourselves, and we can often forget this. Modern beliefs and habits have become so ingrained within us that you probably don't realise how differently we see the world from those people that lived 1,000 years ago, let alone over 10,000 years ago. And one of these differences is how a day was perceived. For us, sunrise marks the start of a new day, but we have much evidence to suggest that our ancestors saw the sun setting as marking the end of one day and the start of another. And if we think about it, the cosmogony of many of the ancestors of Neolithic farmers and the Indo-Europeans, well, the way they perceived the universe had within it creation myths where the beginning had nothing, no light, no sun, sometimes even no God. And then the cosmos came from this, light came to be, sometimes made by God. And so if we applied this template of light following darkness at the start of time, then it would make sense that night time would mark the start of the day, and then light follows. And we do see evidence of this in archaeological sites, and I'll talk more about those in a minute. But we also see evidence that the evening marks the start of the day in ancient texts. Even in the Bible, in Genesis 1:5, there is the line, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And so it implies that the evening comes before the morning in measuring the day. And so you may be asking yourself, well, when did this change? When did midnight or daylight mark a new day? Well, we certainly see this change starting to happen in Greek culture as it evolved, although with multiple administrative centres, there was no one dictate across that region that made it change in unity and have the same understanding. But we definitely see this sort of acknowledgement of daylight marking a new day. And this was taken by the Romans, because the Romans did take a lot of things from Greece. And by the end of the Roman Empire, days were pretty much defined as sunrise as opposed to sunset. And so now we can start to understand why this is important for us to understand, because if we take the day as starting at sunset and the beginning of the night, then so the year could be considered as beginning with the longest night, the darkest time, and this night was the winter solstice. You may often hear that the winter solstice represented a time of rebirth, a new year, and this is a very agricultural influenced view. We see stories of gods, heroes and heroines going into the dark and then re-emerging, and this dark place was often the other world or the underworld. We have stories from the Old Norse Baldur's Dream, the Greek story of Persephone, the Egyptian story of Osiris, and there are Near Eastern stories such as those with Adonis, just to mention a few. And I'll talk about those in this video if you want to know more. But many of these stories are as much about the seasons and drought and the need for rain as they are about summer going into winter and back to summer. So rather than a recycling of the year, they're worried about going from drought to rain. But that doesn't mean our agricultural farming ancestors were ignorant of what was going on. They knew that once the longest night of the year had passed, then days would get longer, lighter, that spring and summer would follow, and that they would then know how much food they would need to survive for the rest of the dark, cold nights, as the months immediately after the solstice were often known as the famine months, for starvation was most common at this time of year, especially if the previous year's harvest hadn't gone well, or too much food was eaten over the winter. And so this all gave a reason to celebrate the solstice as the most important event of the year. Now, there is an important aspect to the winter solstice, and in fact any of the events within the year that were orientated around the sun, and that is that most of the measures of time were done by the moon. And the reason for this is that the moon had a visible cycle going from a new moon to a full moon and back to a new moon again over a period of around 29.5 days, and it could be seen by everyone. It was regular, and so this method of measuring time was adopted by many cultures across the world. The problem is that the solstice did not align to the moon's cycles, and so how could our ancestors understand when it was going to happen by just looking at the sky? They couldn't. They could estimate it maybe based on lunar cycles, but it wouldn't necessarily be accurate, and so we see Neolithic farmers start building calendars that measured the setting sun, because the setting sun is when the day starts. But these calendars weren't the things you hang on the wall. These were these amazing Neolithic structures we see particularly across Western Europe, and probably the most famous of these is Stonehenge. But we also see many of these monuments across Scotland, with Maeshowe in the Orkney Islands, and we have Newgrange in Ireland. There the sunlight shines straight down its entrance passage for 20 minutes on the day of the winter solstice. And we also see many stone monuments in France, particularly around the Brittany area. But what many people really do not realise is that whilst we still see a fair number of these monuments, many have been destroyed. And mostly this is because of the second agricultural revolution, where much land was turned into fields for farming, and the Neolithic monuments that stood upon the land, well, they were moved or destroyed and recycled. And so you see certain parts of England, for example, losing as much as 80% of their monuments, which is why areas such as the southeast of England seem relatively sparse of such things when compared to the rest of the country. But where these structures remain, and specifically those that are circular in design, then we see them often having alignment to the sunset and the winter solstice. But by basic cosmology, this also means that they align with the sunrise on the summer solstice. And what is interesting is that this latter point has led many people to believe that such monuments were built for the summer solstice and not the winter solstice. Now, it is important to note that perhaps these structures were used throughout the year, and so they would have possibly been used for the summer solstice as well as the equinoxes and the like, because if we really think about it, it seems very unlikely that such a large monument would be built to be used just once a year. However, there is really little evidence that helps us understand when these rituals were in European sources. We do see hints in Old Norse texts, in some of the historian texts from the Romans, and perhaps our best evidence is from Babylonian and Sumerian archaeology, with buildings that are aligned to the setting sun and shows, therefore, awareness of the setting sun at particular times of year, including the winter solstice. And with more information on these cultures being available to us, because writing was around longer in these parts, we actually see more documentation about these rituals. And through this, we also then see that sun gods were significant deities in both Akkadian and Sumerian cultures, along with many mentions of the agricultural festivals. Now, this acknowledgement of the importance of the sun, and therefore also the absence of the sun, and so the longest night, often suggests that feasts would occur at this time. And if there was plenty of livestock, with livestock being expensive to keep over the winter months, then cultures could sacrifice all the excess livestock, knowing the days of fertility were ahead and that the animals would then breed and the crops would grow in the future. And so such celebrations were significant, and so in turn would help justify the building of monuments such as Stonehenge. Whilst there is little in the direct archaeological record about the rituals of Paleolithic cultures, it would be fair to say that they would have been aware of the length of nights, as they too were almost certainly considered the day starting when the sun set. But night and death go hand in hand. And this is an important point to consider. Why is that? And this is probably psychological. And one way to explain this, for example, is if you go into a cave, and our ancestors used to think a cave as being a portal to the other world. And in this other world, it was linked to death. It is where the life force went. And we see many Paleolithic burials happening in caves, almost certainly because of this. And so, whilst caves allowed them to go into the earth to escape from our world, they also allowed them to escape the light, and this absence of light, or what our ancestors thought was a growth of dark, as there is a belief that our ancestors considered dark to emanate from a source much like light does from a candle or bulb. And so a long night would have been thought of as darkness growing around the people who saw it, and they would possibly think that the other world was encompassing them. And to escape this, and probably the weather as well that is often associated with long winter nights, our ancestors would have found shelter for long periods, and in that shelter they would have probably told stories about the other world, about the dead, about their ancestors, all of the time, further enhancing the belief of night and death going hand in hand. And we see hints of this in cultures such as the Persian culture, where there's an old Iranian custom called Yalda night, celebrated on Winter Solstice, and that's a coming together of the family, and they feast and they read poetry. And one such night that encompasses this, which is modern or well known about in the Western world, is Halloween. Now, whilst I have made a video about Halloween, I do want to point out here that any specific days of the year, such as the 30th of October, when we celebrate Halloween, and which some neo-pagans consider the most important day of the year for them, well, they aren't important dates in terms of traditional religions, in terms of our Neolithic farming and Indo-European ancestors. And the reason for this is that the year wasn't measured by calendars, it was measured by the moon and the number of full moons. There was no Julian or Georgian calendar in Europe 3,000 years ago. Halloween didn't exist on the 30th of October, as there was no 30th of October. But what is interesting, and the reason why we see Neolithic monuments being a form of calendar, is that the winter solstice is not represented by a moon. It could occur when the moon was in any stage of its lunar cycle, full, half, quarter. And again, this suggests such a specific unmoving date for Night of the Dead could not exist as a 30th of October. It's a moving field. And so, to summarise all this, the most well-known justifications for celebrating the winter solstice are often due to the agricultural cycle. However, this night was known long before farming and agriculture. Our hunter-gatherer ancestors would have been aware of the night getting longer and the days shorter, and they had beliefs and rituals associated with this. They had stories such as that of the Wothu, the wild hunt, the wild spirits that hunted and inspired through nighttime winds and storms. These were spirits of the dead, again linking the dead and the night. And so we can feel sure that our ancestors aligned the night with the other world, with the dead. And for when the night is longest, it means the dead were closer to you for longer. And this means that any portals between this world and the other worlds they believed in were open for longer, allowing spirits and animals that could traverse between these worlds to wander between them for longer. This was an aspect that was taken into Halloween. But in truth, it was the longest night which represented hope that the new year was coming, alongside the knowledge that the night brought you as close to the dead as any day. And for me, the winter solstice is to be celebrated for those of traditional religions, a night of feasting, of storytelling, poems, being with your family, your friends, your tribe, and knowing that the next day will be brighter and lighter, and a hope that things will be better. Stay safe and well. And this was Crack and Forth.